Welcome to Therapy Cable. I'm Dr. G, and this video will be based on feedback that we received from one of our viewers about the relationship between anxiety and personality disorders. So first of all, thank you very much for leaving the feedback and asking about the video. That's what we love to do, and I encourage all of our viewers to let us know what they would like to know about, and we will produce some videos on that. This topic of relationship between anxiety and personality disorder is particularly interesting because if we understand the impact and the nuances of personality traits, a person can be in a better shape, if you will, to deal with their anxieties and worries in life. Because really every personality trait, not just disorder, but kind of a lighter version of the intensity of a personality disorder, being more or less a tendency or traits or characteristics that lie on the same spectrum, are helpful in helping us navigate our way around certain stressful events. And to give you an example, for instance, if a person is struggling with some aspects of, let's say, OCPD, which is Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder from cluster C, and knowing that they have a tendency toward perfectionism and wanting everything in place and in order and needing to control things in their lives and in their environment, then they can become a lot more aware about sources of their anxiety and be able to limit not only those sources, as well as focus and direct their own approach and energy toward management of those stressors, as well as their own anxiety, such as it's like kind of a self-affirmation. If they're getting too worried, what they can tell themselves is that yes, things are not in order, but it's probably their personality characteristics, or in worst case scenario OCPD, kicking in. And rather than worrying too much about the situation and catastrophizing that this whole situation is going to get out of hand, they can remind themselves that this is a tendency I have to want to control the situation. This is a tendency I have to want to manage everything to perfection, but it's not necessary, let's say in this case. And therefore, I can remind myself that it is not going to be an end of the world, but more or less a little bit of stressful situation that I can work myself through. It's going to be okay in the end. Compared to a different personality trait or disorder, let's pick one from cluster B. In this case, borderline personality disorder would be characterized by a tendency of emotional dysregulation in light of feeling rejected or abandoned or disapproved of. So a person who has those traits can again remind themselves that I'm getting overly anxious and worked up in this situation, perhaps because I feel a little bit disapproved of and rejected. That's my own tendency, that's my own thing that I'm working on to get over. Again, it's not the end of the world, it's not a complete lost situation. I can handle it, I can get over it. It requires a lot of self-affirmation in each of these cases in order to overcome that worrisome situation. However, one person with OCPD would tell themselves a little bit of a different story than someone with borderline personality. So this is just an example. Let's go through those personality disorder categories and clusters to understand more in depth how to deal with anxiety and worries. So cluster A was the odd eccentric cluster, which really revolves around the cornerstone of all these personality disorders in that category, being schizotypal, schizoid, and paranoid personality disorders, which all revolve around a notion of disconnect between their own reality and skills of coping of the situation, as well as the environment, and what is happening in terms of the expectation and demand from the society. So, for example, paranoid personality is overly paranoid, worried because of, let's say, a sense of safety. They believe that the world is not safe, they are not safe, everybody is out there to get them. And if they are being made aware of this tendency, then what they can do is literally remind themselves that they may be exaggerating, they may be reading too much into the situation. And as we have talked about this personality disorder before, one of the best coping mechanisms they would have is to rely on someone that they trust. So rather than relying on their own logic and thinking rationale, because that is something that is like a spiral, almost like destructive way of thinking and analyzing the situation that leads them to the worst case scenario, they can rely on somebody else, like a third party that would have a little bit more objective viewpoint, and ask that person, are they worrying too much? Are they reading too much into the situation? Do they really need to be worried in this particular situation? And then as the result, they can literally reduce their anxiety in that moment, just by feeling more grounded, more safe and secure, more supported by the trusted person. A person with schizoid personality disorder will have a little bit of a harder time to do so, because typically what happens with schizoid personality is that they shun society and social interaction. They're not even interested in those types of human exchange, if you will, and connection. Therefore, they may get overly isolated, and then if they worry and stress too much, then really there is nobody around to be able to connect to or rely on or get support from. So the burden lies heavily with themselves to really just pass the time that is so worrisome and anxiety provoking by engaging in some kind of a distractive and distracting behavior, such as, let's say, reading a book, watching a movie, just not thinking about the situation. Even though it's not really the best approach, a long-term approach, because if there is a problem, they're not thinking about the problem or the solution, then they're really not doing anything about it, so the situation may worsen. Therefore, ultimately, it would be better to seek help from an expert. However, in the meantime, if they don't want to be too overwhelmed by the problems and lack of the solution, then they can at least distract themselves from that overly anxious, intense, overwhelming feeling for the moment, until they feel better a little bit, in order to then seek some help or advice. With the schizotypal anxiety, with the schizotypal personality disorder, we're talking about a tendency of the individuals really just kind of missing the point here and there, because they have a little bit of an odd sense, an awkward sense of reality, what they experience and the way they feel about themselves and the society and around them is quite in contrast with societal norms. At times they have some aberrant experiences, such as hallucinations or delusional thinking. Therefore, it's hard for them to really match their inner world to the external world, and therefore they come off as odd and awkward and a mismatch, more or less, and they get that type of feedback from other people, where people around them also don't respond very positively and supportively to them. Therefore, they may be at times just kind of feel lost and disconnected and unwanted, as well as have a hard time really to just fit in the society or their environment. So that is also particularly challenging in terms of being able to reach out to someone for help and support. However, internally, again, what they can do is remind themselves that anxiety is really just a fleeting emotion. It's a temporary reflection of the things that are around them. It doesn't last forever. So what they can do is, just like many other personality disorders, as well as just generally any human being, distract themselves from the source of anxiety for now until they find a better moment and opportunity to deal with the situation. Now, distraction is only one of many ways of reducing anxiety. It's not the only way, it's not the best way, but that's just one way of dealing with it. However, there are multiple other options, such as meditation, relaxation, deep breathing, muscle relaxation, guided meditation. Those are all more or less on the same wavelength, I would say, with distraction. Would temporarily help a person overcome a certain situation, to just calm themselves down, use their body as well as greater awareness of their whole existence to counter this flood of emotions and hormones that are popping up within them neurochemically. Those are generally well-established methods of dealing with anxiety for anyone. Here, what we want to do is really try to find a better match to a person's personality traits. And as I mentioned, for cluster A, because of these particular characteristics that each person has, they can remind themselves that this is my particular tendency, script, habits, if you will, and it's going to be okay. I just need to go and get over this particular hurdle for now. Overall, things are going to be fine, and I'm going to improve in my life. When it comes to cluster B, we are talking about a dramatic, emotional type of a category, where the subcategories of personality disorders within this cluster, being borderline personality, narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial, all tend to make a lot more out of the situation, exaggerate, intensely engage in emotional reactivity to the situation. That tendency tends to also exacerbate their problems and their situation, because it more or less hijacks their mind from literally calming down and tending to the solution toward a exacerbation and more kind of digging into the problem and getting lost within the problem. I'm just being overwhelmed and flooded by hormones and neurotransmitters and just feelings. So knowing that, what cluster B personality disorders can do is really just remind themselves that they're emotionally overly sensitive. So they just tend to rely too heavily on feelings, emotions, and this reactivity in the moment. And it's really not necessary in the long run. Therefore, what they can do is just remind themselves that for the time being, actually, they're much better off calming down, regulating their feelings, emotions, which goes back again to what we discussed, those basic principles of emotional management and emotional regulation, in order to let the times pass. These times of stress and worry, they only last for a few minutes or hours. No worry or no emotionally intense situation in life lasts for much longer than that. Things change. Change is inevitable. Therefore, what we are dealing with is what we call this proverbial wavelength or wave-like type of a phenomenon. Emotionally intense moments because of a certain situation that is heightened for the moment because there is a reason for that, such as maybe an accident happened, maybe a certain altercation occurred, and but then that peak is going to last only for a few minutes or a few hours, if you will. Then it's going to subside. There is going to be a time where people actually can take a break, can calm themselves and address and approach the same situation again from a little bit more calmer, more healthier, more grounded, more secure perspective. Knowing that cluster B personality traits, if you will, and characteristics lead a person to be more aware of their emotional reactivity, and they can remind themselves that this is going to pass. They need to just take a little bit of a different angle, perspective, approach in a few hours or in a few days. Specifically, when it comes to borderline personality, people tend to engage in this tug of war, a lot of times overly involved with other people and too close to enmeshed with them, and at times completely distancing themselves from them, shutting down, not wanting to talk to them, withdrawing and isolating. So rather than engaging in these types of pull and push type of a behavior to the extremes, what they can remind themselves is that they need to find a middle ground rather than leaning and running into these extremes, which is going to make the situation just worse. Remaining in the middle ground and allowing time to pass will also give them a better perspective of the situation with a lot more information that they can use to make an informed decision, which in the end also going to, and on the long run, also going to help them with better solutions in their lives. With the histrionic personality trends, what we have here is more of also anxiety management or emotional dysregulation, but they tend to engage in a lot of seductive behavior, a lot of sensual, sexual behavior, and very flamboyant and overly dramatic, which may really send the wrong message to other people. So what they could benefit from is to learn that some of these decisions, some of these behaviors they would engage in actually could make the situation worse. So again, kind of toning down on their intensity and reminding themselves that there are many other ways of dealing with the situation. An overly sensual, sexual, seductive, manipulative way that does not need to be the best way, and most of the time is not the best way, and ultimately may backfire. So what they can do, again, remind themselves that I may be contributing to my anxiety or to the stress of the situation by my behavior. So they may kind of take a look back at what I've been doing or I am doing, which requires some feedback from others, honest inquiry about honest feedback from others, how they fare in their relationships, and taking that feedback to heart and adjusting their behavior ultimately would result in less anxiety in their lives. And with the narcissistic personality disorder, what we are really talking about in terms of their that's a very complex personality by itself. We can go into almost two dual presentations of narcissistic personality, which would take a lot more time. But to summarize it, what I would say is the lack of empathy and this kind of complete disconnection between an omnipotent inner sense of kind of all-empowering type of a inner world that they have that doesn't match the outside world itself, can be source of anxiety for them, and without them realizing that it is actually what leads to more stressful events in their lives. So there's a lot of subconscious elements that really lie at the foundation of all these anxiety disorders and traits, but specifically with narcissism, because people with a lot of narcissistic tendencies, they don't even know how narcissistic they are, how they come across to others, which then leads to a buildup of stressors and problems in their lives. So ultimately, if anyone is aware of their own narcissistic traits, I would again say that they may want to look at that as a contributor and remind themselves that, again, honest feedback, especially from a trusted professional such as a therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, would be very helpful, because they can get that more of a neutral, well-meant, well-intended feedback from a professional in terms of how they may come across in their lives that would lead to more conflict in their relationships. If they can become aware of that, they can actually reduce a lot of the anxiety that exists in their lives. And antisocial is one of the hardest, really, because they may not even be interested in that type of anxiety reduction, because what they're doing already is all revolved around their own anxiety reduction by completely disconnecting themselves from the norms of the society and just rebelling against the society. However, what I would suggest is, if anyone would again become acutely aware of this tendency, a personality, as a problem, if they start to see it as a problem and recognize and admit that they need to change that, it would be helpful to know how they can overcome their own sense of inner rebellion against authority, and that they stop seeing evil, let's say, in people with authority or positions with authority. They open their mind and see benefits of authority, why we need that notion of authority in a societal structure where there are multiple hierarchies, where things could get out of hand, where authority can actually lead to the establishment of order and organization within a complex social structure. If they can educate themselves and inform themselves about those benefits, then they can actually learn how to live with it and get along with it, and come to respect it to a point that it serves them and the society better. Lastly, which we actually kind of started with, cluster C, OCPD was a good example, but the other two, avoidant personality and dependent personality disorders, as being part of the anxious, worrisome type of a category and cluster of personalities. Again, the main concern is revolving around anxiety itself. It's the fearful, anxious category, meaning that the whole problematic tendencies as a personality they have is to reduce mainly anxiety. So it's actually the personality trait and or disorder is designed to as a coping style, as well as what we call a defense mechanism, to reduce anxiety in general. However, it also becomes an impediment overall. For instance, let's say dependent personality, somebody who doesn't want to make decisions in their lives, ultimately, turn over their life and their fate to somebody else, which by itself can become a source of anxiety and stress in their lives. Paradoxically, in contrast and contrary to what they believed. However, what can, let's say, come up with examples how a dependent personality, person with a dependent personality can actually counteract against a source of stress and anxiety. What they can do is remind themselves of their difficulty that they have around decision making, and kind of accept the situation unless they're actually working on graduating from this coping skill and putting it behind themselves and getting over it in therapy. If they're not engaged in therapy, if they're highly dependent on others, then they can become simply accepting of the situation, that this is what they're dealing with. They have a high source of anxiety around making decisions, but there is a trusted source that they can rely on. Now, gradually involving themselves in that process of decision making and learning how to actually make good decisions would perhaps be helpful to them, because then they can start seeing the benefit that comes out of the process of thinking, analyzing, and a good decision making, and also learning how to live with the consequences of some bad decisions that are manageable. Let's say there's a loss that can be managed, and learning how to deal with small amounts of loss and failure ultimately can lead to ability of dealing with bigger amounts or size of loss and failure, which is really again one of the core characteristics of at the foundation of being able to succeed in life. Because people who don't learn how to live with losses, they can also have a hard time with succeeding in life. They don't even want to take risks, and they are paralyzed, they get stuck. We know people who do succeed in life and achieve certain milestones. They have experienced losses and failures. They continually experience losses and failures. However, they have learned to deal with them, to cope with them, to get over them, and more or less be able to ignore them to some extent and absorb the losses and just kind of get back on track and focus on their successes in their lives. It's a management of their focus and attention. It's not a complete absence of failures and losses in their lives. So, and then lastly, the avoidant personality disorder, who just kind of is highly fearful of, sense of rejection, failure, even connection and attachment. So what they do, they tend to just avoid situations where these types of feelings can pop up and get them in trouble. Again, very similar approach. The fact that they are currently experience this type of overwhelming, paralyzing anxiety is really a product of their prolonged way of avoiding situations. So as a result, they haven't really learned how to deal with situations. So again, it is a matter of learning principles, of going back to the basics, to learn to face certain manageable situations despite the a small amount of rejection, of disapproval, and learning to live with those small amounts of rejection, disapproval, and again focusing on the benefit of being engaged in the society, being engaged in a relationship, being engaged with people. It's a matter of learning principle, and that can lead to appreciating relationships and connection with others, and be less anxious and worried about them. So bottom line, when it comes to these personality characteristics, each one of them would offer a little bit of an angle, if you will, a particular angle that a person is typically and predictably struggling with, And as if a person can detect that angle, then they can really limit and focus their attention, limit the damage, limit the anxiety, limit the stress, and focus their attention on that particular skill. And generally, what I would suggest lastly is that anxiety is not always a bad thing. We tend to want to avoid it and kind of prevent it, but we also have to understand really why anxiety exists. Generally, what we know is anxiety, for instance, can also itself be regarded on a scale of very low, what we call a signal anxiety, which can be beneficial to a person's reality and dealing with the reality around them, to a neurotic anxiety, neurotic level of anxiety where it becomes overwhelming and debilitating and actually should be managed as well as kind of dealt with from not just by a person by themselves, but also with the help of a professional. And then psychotic anxiety, which is extremely dysfunctional and really creates a completely different set of reality for a person, which then we would actually would have to medicate or otherwise contain. But we're going back to the very low grade level of anxiety that a lot of us experience on a daily basis, which we call a signal anxiety. The reason we call it a signal anxiety because it is signaling something. It is signaling a discrepancy. It's signaling a need for attention. So rather than avoiding and preventing that type of a little worry that every one of us experience once in a while, maybe even 10 times a day, it would be prudent for people to actually pay attention to that signal anxiety. Ask themselves, first of all, acknowledge that there may be a benefit, and in fact there is a benefit to experiencing that little sense of worry or anxiety. It is signaling that part of our life needs more attention. So digging deeper into it and asking ourselves, what is it in my life that actually requires more attention from me, and paying it its due attention in terms of kind of doing a little bit self-introspection, taking the time to examine and analyze parts of our lives would be beneficial, because ultimately we don't miss the boat. We don't miss the opportunity of something within our psyche, within our within ourself, within our experience of the world, is alerting us to an area of our life that could benefit from our spending time and attending to it. It could be a little bit of a relational issue. Maybe we have ignored some relationships. Could be a financial issue. Maybe we have ignored paying a bill or being on time with some expenses, or even making money, possible source of revenue generation. It could be a health-related issue that we may have postponed for a while, but again, part of our mind wants to get our attention back on track to pay attention to that. Something that, if not attended to, could be exacerbated down the road and turn into a big disease or disorder that would require medical attention and tons of money to heal. So there are many areas in our lives that actually deserve attention, and anxiety a lot of times is beneficial because it reminds us that there is an area that has been ignored. Why don't we pay attention to it? As bottom line, a huge benefit of anxiety. A lot of times I liken it to an alarm clock, where a lot of times when my clients, I talk to my clients in a private session, and they're highly worried about certain areas of life and say, how can I not worry? And I bring this up as an analogy. Well, it's just like a snooze button. If something like an alarm clock goes off in your life over and over again, and you're pressing the snooze button, well, down the road it's going to alarm again. So what you want to do is really not press the snooze button, just kind of get up and pay attention. That's what it is. Anxiety at times can be a good thing. So bottom line, we covered anxiety and relationship between anxiety and some personality disorders and traits. I hope you enjoyed this video clip. Please leave us some feedback. We would like to know how to improve our production as well as the content of these videos, and we would love to hear more about other topics that you would like us to produce some videos. Thank you for watching, and spread the word and come back to Therapy Cable. Have a wonderful day.